One of the important things you're trying to do from the Soviet perspective is, can you drive a wedge into American society? Can you separate people across, whether it's races or politics or soldier versus pacifist or whatever? How can we drive wedges in that area? Well, you start beginning by planting false news stories.
Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us Ronald Rychlak. He's an author of a book called Disinformation, and he's also a law professor at the University of Mississippi. And so, Ron, real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, Josh. I'm very excited to be here.
And so, for those who don't know, Ron co-authored the book Disinformation with Ion Mihai Pacepa. And Ron, why don't you tell our viewers about Pacepa? He's a very interesting individual.
He truly is. He's the highest-ranking defector from the Soviet bloc during the entire Cold War era. He was the right-hand man to Ceausescu in Romania. He ran foreign intelligence for Romanians, and he knew Castro and Khrushchev and all of the high-ranking communists of that era, and he risked everything. I mean, he risked his life and everything he had to escape the tyranny of communism when he saw what it was to come to the United States. He came over here under President Carter. Carter at first was afraid he was an agent of disinformation and threatened to send him back, which would have been a death sentence for him. Pacepa ultimately spent 3 years providing information to the CIA about communist infiltration and everything that was happening really across the United States and in behind the Iron Curtain. And though that information eventually became the basis of a book called Red Horizons. Red Horizons was translated into 28 different languages. It was smuggled behind the Iron Curtain. It was very much used in the ultimate overthrow of Ceausescu, and made Pacepa sort of a national hero to some people, although those who remain loyal to Ceausescu were trying to kill Pacepa. There was an assassination squad sent here and all kinds of fascinating stuff.
And so Ron was talking about disinformation and active measures and subversion before these became buzzwords kind of after 2016. Ron was talking about this a whole lot longer before that. And Ron, I know that, in fact, some of the original stories we did on, Spygate and the whole Trump-Russia collusion thing, I interviewed you a few times, and you've also written quite a few stories for Epoch Times as well around this and related topics. And so why don't we start off with the idea of, I guess because Trump-Russia stuff, disinformation, it's a buzzword. Why don't you first tell us what your perspective is on the whole Spygate thing? And I know you've talked about Russian disinformation. You're obviously very concerned about Russian disinformation, but you also didn't jump on the bandwagon with all this stuff.
No, not at all. And part of the reason, you're right to say, I was taught about disinformation from Pacepa. Pacepa and I think, first made contact in about 2009. Our book Disinformation came out in 2013. We wrote another ebook that came out in 2016. He had worked really in the highest levels of Soviet bloc disinformation, where they considered this a science. There were more people working in disinformation during the Cold War than worked in the Soviet military, for instance. I mean, it was a massive organization, and they used to have to float stories up. They'd plant it in a newsletter, in a local newspaper, something, and ultimately try to build that story until it took over. Well, today with social media and everything else, it's much easier to plant those kind of stories. So it's disinformation on steroids. But the thing is, because of Pacepa, I've gotten to know so many people who risked their lives to escape from communism, who really dislike Pacepa, Putin, dislike Putin and what the Russians are doing today. And to a man, and I think they're all men, they were quite certain that Putin would not have supported Trump. He would have supported Hillary, and he would not have wanted what they would say a tough guy or a strong man like Trump to stand up against them. So when I heard all this stuff about the Russians trying to help put Trump in place. It never made sense to me. And I think as the story has unfolded, it's become clear that they were trying to throw in monkey wrenches into the election. They've always done that. That's not a surprise. But they weren't trying to help Trump. And I think that's where this whole narrative got skewed very early in the process.
And now, Ron, I know you've also written a lot about, I mean, really, you and Pacepa were the guys who really wrote the dictionary, essentially, on disinformation and on, say, the evolution of Soviet active measures, even relating to what's being done today. Really, if anyone's interested in this, check out his book, Disinformation. It's really good. And Ron, you talk a lot about what subversion is and how disinformation ties into it. But maybe we should start off by explaining to our audience what the difference is in your analysis, or at least in your studies, I guess, between disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Because a lot of journalists, they blend these, they use these words interchangeably, but they're actually very different.
They do get blended too frequently. And that's the thing Pacepa was very insistent upon as we worked upon this, that disinformation is it's a science form. It's something that really they're cultivated. Propaganda, everyone understands it's propaganda. There used to be ministries of propaganda. You'll see during World War II, a lot of the militaries had ministries that were putting out things to pump up their people, make their people feel good, criticize the foreign entity or whatever. Misinformation is close to that. There are stories that are put out in the news, but they're from a source that you kind of know is not trustworthy. Pravda during the Cold War era, during the Soviet era, you knew it was a government organ, and so when something came out in Pravda, you didn't trust it. Disinformation is an active, really intelligence or military maneuver by which a story is planted in a reliable source. The story has to be something that's built around a kernel of truth. It cannot be easily disproven, so you won't have original documents. You'll have photocopied documents. You'll have things that will be very hard to disprove. And you will filter it and cultivate it and allow it to grow so that ultimately it will be cited by very trustworthy sources, and people won't recognize its heritage, how it came from very untrustworthy sources. It seems quite clear that the Russians have today, and in fact with social media have it at an even higher level, but where they're willing to invest a lot of time and a lot of effort to grow a story. One of the interesting things Pacepa always said was, you think of spies stealing information, but the most damage that spies ever do is planting false information. And the classic story, of course, is all the work that the Soviets did to undermine American faith in our government, particularly during the Vietnam War.
And tell us about that, just as kind of a real example of how disinformation works. What did they do during the Vietnam War? And of course, for our viewers too, Pacepa, one of the reasons why this is such an interesting subject is Pacepa was one of the main guys running these operations. Pacepa was in their offices, taking direct orders to do these types of things and was carrying it out before he defected.
He really was. He actually developed some of the ideas and planted some of the false stories. And really, when he came to the United States, he said he wanted to come to the United States to undo several of the stories that he had helped cultivate that he knew were false.
Yeah, and Pacepa is still he lives under an alias, he's under protection, and Ron is one of the few people that he trusts and he's in contact with. Right,
and he's a wonderful guy, still sharp as a tack.
He's old now too.
He's 90. Yeah. He's 90, but we still regularly correspond. Take the Vietnam War. The story that we heard, for instance, when John Kerry came back from Vietnam as a young soldier, and he talked about how American troops had slaughtered innocents in villages and done horrible things and all this kind of stuff. And he used some language that when Pacepa heard it, he said, that's exactly what we had put out. Now, Kerry was not intentionally spreading false information. He was not an agent of the Soviets. I don't want to imply anything like that. But he had heard the stories often enough. He believed them. He repeated them. And what more credible source is there than an articulate young soldier coming back very disillusioned because he's bought into the disinformation that he's heard, and he is now repeating it, and people are hearing him, and that's the magnitude, that's the power that disinformation has, in that it just spreads on its own once it kind of catches hold, once you develop it to that point. And then pretty soon everybody is giving up on the American military. And I think even today we're living with the ramifications of that, of men who came back after fighting and seeing their friends get killed, were not welcomed home by their country. And where I think the country's trying to make up for that a lot now, because it was wrong. But that was a very intentional effort by the Soviets to make Americans react that way.
Yeah, and it takes on a life of its own. It's one of the natures of disinformation. It becomes a cultural truth, even because people become so disconnected from the origin of it. It begins as a rumor. It begins as a newspaper report, which is then repeated by public officials, which is then repeated by other media, which then goes on to affect public opinion, and which over time, the origin of it is then lost. Is this accurate?
Absolutely. You know, sometimes when they're first planning it, they'll get it into a union, trade letter. I mean, you get it into wherever you can get it, and you get it into two of those, and then you get it into a local weekly somewhere, and that gets picked up on a news broadcast somewhere, and pretty soon it's been reported in 4 places, and so a newspaper will run a little column and on the 15th page about it, but then it's in 4 or 5 of those, and it consolidates. And if you continually have people promoting that idea, and that's a big part of disinformation, is that you take these stories and you continually promote them and push them and make sure that they stay in the news, they do develop that life of their own. And next thing you know, you've got well-intended people, John Kerry, repeating stories that really were fabricated.
Yeah, I think another good example in the book you mentioned is the burning of the black churches. And you'll find a lot of people to this day who, they believe this happened, and it didn't actually happen. I think it even went to the presidential level in terms of condemning what took place, and it wasn't until years later they did a study and found out, wow, this whole thing was fabricated. But
yeah, Bill Clinton talked about in his youth remembering the black churches being burned, and they're all across Arkansas and this and that. And then, they went back and they checked, and it hadn't happened at all. I don't think Bill Clinton was intentionally trying to mislead the American people. It had been kind of built into his psyche, and he sort of remembered it, and he spoke about it, and next thing you know, he's spreading disinformation.
Interesting. So why don't you tell us the story of the burning of the black churches and how that spread, because it's an interesting case, actually.
Well, it is, and it's once again, one of the important things you're trying to do from the Soviet perspective is, can you drive a wedge into American society? Can you separate people across, whether it's races or politics or soldier versus pacifist or whatever? How can we drive wedges in that area? Well, you start beginning by planting false news stories. There were some churches that have been burned along the way, of course. A lot of them were burned from lightning strikes or accidental or whatever. There were some that were actually burned by people for insurance fraud or other reasons like that. But the disinformation story presents a large number of these taking place. The Soviets pump up the idea that this was something that was happening across the South in particular, and that it's driven by white racists who are, very evil people who are trying to terrorize the black people. And obviously, we've had a history of some things like that. But we're talking here about from the 1960s to the 1980s is when they were really focusing, I think, on Clinton's. That's what Clinton was remembering in his youth. pretty soon, you're writing stories not as they're happening, but as we all remember in the 1970s when there was a slew of church burnings across the South. And that becomes a line that gets repeated in news stories time and time again, even though it hadn't happened. And pretty soon you got the president remembering the burnings of churches that took place when he was a young man in Arkansas. And no one's questioning that. Well, why would you? And he wasn't part of an active measure. Again, like John Kerry, he had bought into the disinformation story, but it took on a life of its own. And so the president's saying it's a completely trustworthy source. Nobody's questioning it until some point down the road later on, they go back and actually go through the newspapers and go through the history and find out, you know what? Not only was there not a slew of churches being burned, there were virtually none. The handful that happened were all attributed to non-racial matters. But the Soviets had gotten great mileage out of it in the interim.
Now, you mentioned one of the things the Soviets wanted to do was drive wedges between different segments of society. Why would they want to do that? And of course, we know we see it these days too, right? With a lot of these, especially far left or communist groups that believe in class struggle or the struggle of opposites. They want this. But maybe you could explain to us why that is. Why did the Soviets do this? Why do these groups these days also do this?
Well, let's start with the Soviet era. In the Soviet era, obviously, we had two superpowers aimed at one another, fighting proxy wars in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, engaged in all kinds of diplomatic back and forth around the world. So anything that could be done to weaken us was seen as beneficial to the Soviets. So they were continually doing things that would weaken American resolve, in particular, American resolve to stand up to the spread of communism, to stand up to the Soviet Union. And so any wedges you can drive in there between the military and the civilians, between Republicans and Democrats, between blacks and whites, anything you can do that weakens the United States was good from a Soviet perspective. So that contributed, that was a significant goal for them. I think today you see Putin desirous of, with him, he said, the great tragedy of the 20th century was the Soviet Union falling apart. I think he very much would like to restore that sort of power that he felt in Russia or the Soviet Union in his youth. And what's the significant stumbling block to that happening? Well, certainly the United States is a significant stumbling block to that happening. When nations, I was just in Poland within the last month, Poland was under the thumb of the Soviets for so long, and they're very fond of the United States today. And I think they're very fond of the United States in part because they see the United States as someone who will protect them from another Soviet invasion. I don't know if it'd be an invasion, but intrusion or whatever you want to call it. I think that, a lot of those nations look to the West, look to the United States. Obviously, Europe has some role, but Europe's been weakened, and none of those individual nations are quite what the United States is in terms of military. So you still see China is obviously very important in there, but you still see, I think, sort of a Russian-American mentality that affects much of the thinking from within Russia and frankly in Washington as well.
Interesting. And now you mentioned a keyword, which is, or a buzzword, I guess it should say, which is active measures. We hear this being tossed around every now and then. But explain to us what active measures are from the standpoint of your own research.
Well, an active measure would be when we set a goal, for instance, to topple a leader, to force some sort of change within a government. I think we feel like we're a target more than we think of our own actions across the way. So you might say an active measure might have been, certainly the Democrats argued that an active measure was the Russians tried to stop Hillary from becoming president. I think they probably thought Hillary would win, like much of the pollsters all said, and they thought they could weaken her presidency by messing with it a little bit, maybe letting Trump show a little bit of strength. But I also think that given the choice, they would have preferred her winning. So I don't think they were trying to help Trump win. Anytime you're trying to do something like that, there's an objective there. So what's our objective? Whether it's to I mentioned cause people to question the government in Vietnam. One of the ones Pacheco and I write about in Disinformation is making people believe that the CIA was behind the Kennedy assassination. Whether it's causing people to question their heroes, their religion. One of the things we talk about is bringing up the idea of the Pope during World War II not being sufficiently opposed to the Nazis, how they cultivated that idea. But all of these sort of objectives, let's set an objective, and how can we use disinformation to help accomplish that objective? And I think today you probably would find evidence that the Russians are quite happy to see what's going on in Washington, D.C. now with an American president being impeached. It's sort of a jungle in Washington, D.C. in terms of, if we're thinking about smooth functioning politics, it's not.
Interesting. Now, when you mentioned a few different cases of active measures, and I guess this goes into subversion, which is different uses of active measures to, say, whittle away at or decay the foundations of a society, right? How would you describe subversion? Because it's a complicated issue.
Well, it is, and I think you look at, can you make people question their heroes, question their government, question their history, question their religion? Can you have people? Can you cut the roots? Those are sort of all roots of the fabric of a society. Can you go after those roots? And if you do that, what's left to stand? It's a lot easier to knock down a society once you've cut those things out. And I think that disinformation's been used in all of those ways. I wasn't around in the 1940s and into the early 50s and stuff. But you get the idea that people really believed in America and the American way, and the truth, justice, and the American way, as Superman used to say. You don't have that same feel today, I think, or at least we haven't had it at the same level that it was. And I think part of it is because we've been challenged to question our faith, our government, our religions, our heroes. There's we're tearing down statues all over the place. There are very few heroes you can look at today with the same sort of reverence that 20 years ago I think you did. And that's of concern if you're trying to cause great, if you're trying to build a government. The other side of disinformation, which I haven't talked about, is disinformation can be used to prop up people. And traditionally within the Soviet Union and within Russia, it was used to prop up the reigning government, the reigning leader, the person at the time is,
Ceausescu is known for that. That's right.
Ceausescu was known for that, but and write down all of the Russian leaders, Russian Soviet leaders, they would always, the disinformation was always, the current leader is great, all the problems in the government were the previous leader. And it goes right up to Gorbachev. In fact, we all think of Glasnost as sort of an opening, awakening, a welcoming sort of thing. Glasnost, there was actually an active measures dictionary type report that they had in intelligence offices throughout the Soviet bloc. And Glasnost was defined as polishing or shining the image of the leader. It was presenting, for instance, a Gorbachev as a new man, a new face, someone we can trust. That, by the way, is the same thing they said about Ceausescu. That's they tried to present that about Khrushchev. Khrushchev has one of the most brilliant, high-profile disinformation acts ever when he took over, and he wanted to have this idea that the West should look at him as a new person. He wasn't going to be the same kind of guy that Stalin had been. Now, he could come out and say, I'm not the same kind of guy Stalin is. I'm going to announce that I'm going to be different. I can do all that kind of stuff. But we don't question that. Instead, he called together the leaders in government, and he gave what he called a secret speech. He said, now, I want you all to know Stalin wasn't the great guy that people think he is. He was a pretty bad guy. He led us to all these bad situations we're facing today. I want you to know I'm a different kind of guy. We're going to change. We're going to be more open to the West. We're gonna be a better government than we have been ever in the past. Don't tell people this because we don't want them to question Stalin. But it's going to be different. And then copies of that speech, the secret speech, immediately found their way to the Mossad and the CIA, so that agents of the West discovered the secret speech rather than having it given to them. Since they discovered it, we thought it was real. We believed it more than if he had just come out and said it. So it was a hidden, letting people think they're finding something secret when it really was intended all along to deceive them.
And now you mentioned, just stepping back, you mentioned a few different examples of it. You mentioned, I know Pachepa wrote the book Program to Kill about JFK. You mentioned, of course, the World Council of Churches, the infiltration of the Catholic Church. Maybe we can't cover everything, but I think the infiltration of the churches is something interesting, because people, I think, can look at the Pope these days and say, something ain't right. He seems like he's representing something that goes against what Catholicism used to represent. And I know, Ron, you're a devout Catholic yourself, and I know you've even done work with the Holy See, for example, if I remember right. Tell us about what the Soviets did to the Catholic Church and how that whole thing worked.
There are a few different things the Soviets did. I mean, one thing that I've probably written more on than anything else is that they framed Pope Pius XII, the World War II Pope, as Hitler's Pope, tried to present him as someone who didn't care about the Jews and only cared about either his personal safety or the power of the church, or there are a bunch of other false things that people claim. But they tried to frame the church as being aligned with the Nazis, which really is not true. In a broader, later development, they really cultivated this idea of liberation theology, which grew really in South America, where the current Pope is from. And again, I would not ever say that he is an agent of the Soviets or intentionally working that, but he grew up, he trained and studied and learned in a culture that the Soviets very actively tried to develop a form of Christianity that is probably as much political as faith-driven. That's very much about political activity, it's leftist social activity is what it is, where your faith doesn't matter unless you're sort of in the streets working for social justice. And social justice is an important thing to Catholic Church. I mean, that's where it gets hard to draw these lines and define things. But the social justice should always come from the faith and come from the religious basis. And liberation theology sort of flips that. And it grew rapidly with support from the Kremlin. I mean, Pachepa wrote that was developed in the Kremlin, and some people have really rebelled against that notion. Whether it was actually developed there or whether it was only seriously cultivated from there, I think is virtually irrelevant. It found fertile ground in South America, where it spread around the world, certainly gotten into not just the Catholic Church at all. I mean, it's the World Council of Churches, as you mentioned, really had a lot of Soviet agents infiltrate into that. These sort of international organizations tend to be where the Soviets will look, or Russians today, but they'll put people where they hope in the future they'll have a lot of power, and they're willing to wait years to develop that. Put some young people in. We know not all of them are going to rise to high levels, but some will, and we'll have some power from it. And that has been done a real disservice for Christianity. I mean, it's when you elevate the social work above the faith, then you may not need faith, and then just be a social club. A lot of really wonderful social clubs that do a lot of great work that are untied to religion, but religion has a separate thing with it, and the Soviets, with some of this work, have tried to downplay that and focus only on the social. And by the way, then they control what the social issues are as well. So they'll decide. There was I guess there still is a Catholic social justice group called Network. Has a position on every political issue you can think of except abortion. It doesn't take a position on abortion because that's a little too controversial, I guess. Whereas the Catholic Church itself is very clear that's an enormous problem.
What I remember from reading your book and also additional studies, the story in Latin America and how liberation theology was created and why it was created is interesting. Pretty much Che Guevara was their guy for the communist revolution in Latin America. He was killed. They said, okay, what do we do now that he's dead? Let's make him into a social icon. And so they used him as kind of like a glasnost type thing, right? They used him as this image to promote an idea. And then they realized that in Latin America, religion was the main institution that was standing in the way of the communist revolution. At the time, if you were a communist, you could be excommunicated by the church. It was considered antithetical to the Catholic Church. And if you go back and read the original letters in terms of why that was, they talk about, well, one, it opposes religion. Communism seeks to destroy religion and traditional, moral values and culture. And in addition to that, through the idea of dialectical materialism, seeks to create and increase antagonisms within society because you want the struggle of opposites for the communist revolution. You want people to fight each other. You want them to hate each other. And so communism was seen as not only as antithetical to the church to the extent that the Pope at the time said you could be excommunicated if you're a communist. And so the question for the Soviets was how do you flip that? How do you turn the church into a tool that can be used to promote the communist revolution? And so they created liberation theology, which reframed Jesus as this, youth revolution Che Guevara type figure, and said, well, if you're a real Christian, a real Catholic, you must support the communist revolution. You must support the struggle.
No, I think that's absolutely accurate. The work with Che Guevara is amazing. I mean, he was a not very pleasant person and really a butcher as well. But he looked kind of cool. He had the long hair that was very popular. Even when I was a young man, there still are the T-shirts and the posters and stuff that show him because he became the face on what was really a very ugly crusade. But he became the face of it because there was that picture that made him look pretty cool to young people. Every officially communist government in the world has been atheistic. We're seeing that unfold in Hong Kong and in China today. I mean, horrible stuff about that. Epoch Times, I wrote about the Catholics' agreement with the communist regime that really drove and it has hurt the underground church in China. And it was Pope Pius XII, I believe, in 1948, who said anyone who voted for communism would be excommunicated. And if we look at World War II, and we always I often talk, people in my circles tend to talk about how the Nazis persecuted the Catholic Church. But if you look at the Soviet Union, what happened in the Soviet Union to all Christian churches, except for a few ones that were maintained really for show, they were driven completely out of business, so to speak. But it was very strong in Central America. So you're not going to drive it out of Central America. So what can you do is you try to convert it. And you create this new idea, this new theology. You promote it again, whether it was, a priest in South America who came up with it and wrote a book. And there's an argument that was the original genesis. And did the Kremlin notice this and then promote it and drive it? Or did they plant it? And that's really irrelevant. The point is they really cultivated, developed, and created this system that really does flip Christianity on its head. So instead of being about faith driving good works, it's about good works. And, oh, by the way, we're going to define what the good works are and tell you what the good works are. And they tend to all support social communist ideas.
And now you said something that some viewers might not like to hear, with the idea that Catholicism that social justice is a core part of the Catholic Church, and Maybe you should explain your perspective on that, because when we hear social justice, we think, attacking people who, have conservative viewpoints. But from what I understand, you're talking more about the charity element. Is this accurate?
Yeah.
Could you explain that to us?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for letting me correct that.
Yeah.
Look, I'm a member of the Society of Catholic Social Scientists. Social justice is treating people with dignity. Everyone should be treated with dignity. Everyone should be treated with respect. We should be fair with what we do. But it's not a political matter. The traditional way Catholics learned about social justice was about respecting people and treating people with dignity. It was not the political activism that we see today when people talk about social justice. So social justice in the traditional way is an important part of the Catholic doctrine. It's corrupted. The phrase what we call social justice today has been corrupted. It's not the traditional Catholic social justice.
When we get into disinformation, a lot of times it does need to have a kernel of truth, some tiny incident that is visible. You can redefine what the meaning of that incident is, and you can emphasize it. You can make it bigger. You can make it larger than life. You can take an existing idea in society and warp the interpretation of it. You mentioned the idea that maybe liberation theology was started by this, individual somewhere, but the Soviets merely latched onto it and enhanced it and used it, or that it's just as possible they started on their own. But you mentioned that the genesis is not so much the important part as is the intended use of it and the use that was carried out. Now, this ties into one element of subversion as well. That sometimes subversion, there have been a lot of different writers on it. A great one is Yuri Bezmenov. He talks a lot about subversion. He wrote a book called Love Letter to America. He does a very popular YouTube video. He of course, is deceased now. But one of the things he mentioned is he compared the Soviet and modern communist tactics around this to judo. You look at processes in motion and you increase their momentum. And not only increase their momentum, but choose the direction in which they go. How do what are the social movements that are destructive to this society? How can we make them stronger? How can we enhance their momentum? How can we make them more destructive? And how can we make sure that their end result is something that serves our own benefit?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think disinformation is focused upon understanding the current status of the society or the organization or the group that you're trying to influence, understand where they are today, what direction they're heading, how can we most effectively change that direction, point it in the direction we want to go. And, and again, disinformation is merely a tool. It can be used in a way that would make people think better of something or think worse of something. Pachepa, when we first started working, he would often use the term frame. You can frame somebody. And in America, we think when you frame somebody, you frame them of a crime and you make them look bad. But he would talk about positive framings. You frame somebody to make them look good. And it's looking through a frame. What frame do you want to depict someone from? And there are different angles, and you can make a bad leader look like a great leader. You can make a good person look like a bad person. Disinformation is very much about picking that frame, getting the people to see things a certain way. And when they see it that way, they will behave accordingly. So when you influence the thought process, you will influence the actions that will follow.
Now let's get into some of the modern uses and, say, problems with this, I guess we could say. Now we can go into like Edward Bernays' early 20th century. I wrote a book called Propaganda, which formed this idea of using information, one as a political weapon, two as a business weapon. And he describes ideology or propaganda as kind of one of the most powerful elements in the world, that whoever controls it is the true hidden power in the world. We get into the Chinese Communist Party today. They talk about the three warfares doctrine, which is psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare, adopted into their military code. Now, psychological warfare is to not change information, but to change the way you interpret information. It is the war of narratives. Media warfare being the control of outlets of information, so not just controlling, say, newspapers, but controlling social media, what people can or can't say the Great Firewall type stuff, so on. And legal warfare being the manipulation of international legal systems to make sure any international conflict is a legal conflict, not a military conflict or a diplomatic conflict, ideally. Then we can get into the idea of memetic warfare, which is kind of one of the buzzwords we have now with politics. A lot of organizations carry out what they call dark PR. There's PR, public relations, to make yourself look good. There's dark PR to attack your competitors. And I'd say people are being bombarded with these different forms of ideological manipulation from every perspective, how an idea can be introduced into society and how it evolves over time to impact the culture. And memetic warfare being the intentional introduction of an idea into society and the manipulation of its development over time to impact the culture in an intended way, which when we get into subversion is a really core piece of it, right?
Well, it sounds a lot like one of the things we write about in Disinformation, which is how the Soviets cultivated anti-Semitism across the Middle East. And Pachepa said before he defected, he would every month send thousands of copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, a sham, a fraud, but it's purportedly minutes of a meeting of a group of high Jewish people who talk about how they're trying to conspire to control the world, and they drink the blood of Christian children, all kinds. So, and it's a fraud, and it's well established as a fraud. But the Soviets were sending it into the Middle East to cultivate anti-Semitism that they saw as a way to weaponize the anti-Semitism that was there against Israel, which was America's closest ally in the Middle East. And they saw this as a way to help shape attitudes. It would sap some power from the United States because the United States would have to be involved in protecting Israel, and it would put Israel in a difficult situation. And the thing is, once that genie kind of got out of the bottle, you can't control that anymore. And the Soviets actually began to have their own problems with some of what they had cultivated in the Middle East, and some terrorism in the Middle East. They cultivated terrorism. They trained actually Yasser Arafat and others.
Palestinian Liberation Front or organization, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They literally trained him in means of terrorism. And they actually claim credit for a number of the early terrorist attacks. But then ultimately, if you've created this genie, you can't control the disinformation when it's out there. And it was used then against Russia. It's been used against Russia, the Soviet Union, after a while. But it was an effort to try to shape a society, shape activities going forward, and encouraging people to act on it, and that happened.
This is something that I found very interesting that Pachepa mentioned, actually, was that the Soviets themselves were sometimes surprised by how fast things developed once they introduced ideas into society. That they themselves could not have anticipated the success of what they did, but that these ideas, once introduced into society, began taking on lives of their own and doing damage to societies in ways that even they never imagined. Okay, Soviet Union collapsed, Cold War, that's like ancient history, who talks about that still? But all these different front organizations, all these different leftist, revolutionary movements that they started are still going. They're still doing what they were set out to do, but I think they don't even know themselves that they were started with a purpose. A lot of them, I would imagine.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of these front groups, we mentioned the World Organization of Churches, and I think there's a National Organization of Churches, both of which were very much cultivated early by the Soviets. And let's not assume that the Soviet Union is as far gone as it might seem to be.
Well, there's two elements. One is when a communist system collapses and it moves to a market economy, who has all the money, right? it's the former Communist Party leaders. They have all the money. And so it's easy for them to just buy up all the businesses and land and resources and to continue running the country as it was, just without the communist, vampiric structure sucking money out of everything. And so, from what I understand, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had the Soviet forces, the communist forces went into two areas. One into the, funny enough, business and politics and landowning, which is funny enough, a lot of communists say they oppose that. And two was into the criminal underworld.
Well, there was a great opportunity to make a lot of money. The oligarchs that came along and took advantage of that. And organized crime is never far beyond. When there's a chance to make significant money, organized crime is going to be involved, whether it's Russia or anywhere else. And absolutely, the Russian mafia, so-called Russian mafia, not only within Russia, but then spread around the world, including into the United States. It was, 20, 30 years ago, 20 years ago anyway, it was a significant issue in New York. I don't know that you hear about it so much anymore, but it spread its wings very far, very quickly. Interesting.
Now, getting into the ideas of where things are at now, how would you say disinformation still exists? Of course, we get into, they talk about Iranian subversion. The Trump administration had a big press release on this, probably maybe a year ago now. The Chinese Communist Party carries it out. They have, departments focused on political warfare, like the General Political Department, which they shifted it and renamed it. General Propaganda Department, these types of things. And you also mentioned the post-perestroika deception. Russia still has these things. We talk about the Internet Research Agency, which, we hear about it because of the whole Trump-Russia, conspiracy, which is really what it was. But it is a real organization, and they have carried out disinformation operations, which have been exposed. Mainly, it seems, to try to paint the United States as chaotic and, not a place you would want to live, essentially. But I'm curious, in your analysis, where do you see disinformation functioning today? And why do you care about it enough to have written a book about it, for that matter?
Well, today the thing about disinformation is much more. I think it used to be concentrated. I think you used to see it primarily from the Soviets, and there were amateurs around who dabbled in it. That's one level or another. But it was as they considered it was a science. And it took a lot of people and it took a long time to cultivate and develop a good story. Today, I think there are many more actors involved. You mentioned Iran, but certainly we've seen some stuff recently from China. And I think we see stuff within the United States because with a few computers, you and I could get a whole lot of information out there that sooner or later people would retweet or repost, and some of them, some stories will catch fire and go viral, as they say, and find their way into the major newspapers and onto network news and stuff like that, have become part of sort of the national culture, things that we all know but are not actually true. I think of the women being beaten up on Super Bowl Sunday. I think of the story of the straws that was developed by a kid in 9th grade for a science fair project that everybody says talks about straws today. There are a number of and a lot of them are environmental. A lot of the stories are environmental. That people put forward and they caught on and people repeated them over and over, which just shows how easy it is to do today. People from a political party, people who want to throw wrenches into politics, can do stuff much more easily. And it's harder to, and it puts more than on us as individuals to try to decipher and try to figure out what is a legitimate story and what's not. And I have a couple of friends who routinely either post or email me stories that are outrageous, and I know they're wrong, and I have to spend I'll spend a little bit of time to compose something to let them know and apply, because they're my friends, family member in one case, who I want to even if I agree with the sentiment, and often I do, often they're sending me stuff because they think I'll agree with it, but it's still wrong. You have to, if you're going to make a case, you got to make it accurately. And there's so much stuff out there that good people are being tricked into falling for, or accidentally are falling for. It's incumbent upon us who have the ability to at least question, to actually make those questions and spend that extra couple of minutes on the internet verifying a story before we repost or retweet or forward it to somebody, because it's just these false narratives are damaging to society in the long run.
And I know, of course, one of the things we have today is that a lot of the big news outlets, a lot of the mainstream news outlets, they're calling for, official fact checkers. They're calling for wars against disinformation. But the problem is, a lot of times their stories have issues too. But right. I guess from your perspective, what solution? I mean, just for our viewers, I think during the Obama administration, Obama made some passed some countering disinformation legislation, and Ron and I spoke, and I know, Ron, I remember you were against it. Maybe you could tell people why you were against any kind of official system to decide what the narrative is, because I think that was an interesting point you made.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I said was that will immediately become the subject of all efforts to infiltrate. If you're going to have someone who defines the truth, that's where the people pushing the false narrative are going to focus. And if they capture that, they've got everything, right? I mean, so if you set somebody up like that, but also I don't trust government to decide the truth. I was in Paris at a convention. I was actually part of the American delegation at a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This was about 2005, 2006. The meeting was to discuss hate speech on the internet. And the American position, of course, is free speech, and we're not going to control speech. And I was invited to speak, and I quoted Voltaire, and I thought I was very elegant, and I think I didn't win anybody over at all. It was very clear that no one listened to me. But what convinced us we were right was that after our presentation, after the American presentation, first there was an NGO, non-governmental organization speaker who said, Christians who try to convert Jews from Judaism must be removed from the internet because they're engaged in hate speech, because they're trying to convert somebody. And whatever you want to say, trying to convert somebody to your faith, I don't think is hate. But even worse, then when it got to the official spokesperson for the Russian delegation said we have to get Hare Krishnas and Jehovah's Witnesses off of the internet because they purport to know the truth. And if they know the truth, if they claim to know the truth, that must therefore be engaged in hate speech. So, I mean, that tells me if you let Russia decide what can be said and what can't be said, they're going to take off Hare Krishnas and Jehovah's Witnesses. I guarantee you Catholics are going to be right there. And all the other religions are going to come along right after that, right? I mean, if you give government that kind of power to determine what is appropriate, what can be said, what can't be said, they're going to mess it up. So I prefer to trust people, even though we're going to make some mistakes sometimes, and even though we will be tricked sometimes. Those of us who have the ability to spend some time to look into stories should do so. Try to correct our friends, our family members, politely. And you can do it in a nice way. Like I said, most people I end up correcting or actually agree. I agree with them. I kind of wish they were right sometimes, but I know it's some of those things are over the top. But we can do that, and we don't need a government agency, which again would immediately become the thing everybody and I still haven't figured out Snopes. I mean, some people say Snopes is actually corrupted that way. I don't know. I'm not saying that they are, but I'm not saying they're not either. But I still look to them regularly.
Great. And so, Ron, where can people learn more about your work?
Well, thanks. I would. I guess the Epoch Times. You can search my name.
He's a contributor. Yeah.
Got many of my articles are posted there. The University of Mississippi, there's a web page that has a lot of my writings linked there, and there's I've done a lot of writing on Pope Pius XII. He's the wartime pope. And I do have a webpage, www.pius, that's Pius, dash XII for Roman numeral 12, Pius dash Roman numeral 12, where there's lots of my writing is there as well.
Great. Ron, real pleasure having you on Crossroads. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Josh. It's been great.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. Click that notification button. See you next time.